Good Jobs First. And I am in charge of the team that created Violation Tracker UK and have led the work on the US Violation Tracker since its creation in 2015. I'm going to give you an overview of the of our new site, Violation Tracker UK. But first, I want to acknowledge, a couple of people who are in the group today. Andy Agathangelou from the Transparency Task Force is the head of in making the UK site come into existence, and Anthony K. Bagley, who is our key UK researcher, who's done a lot of the heavy lifting in bringing together the data on the UK side, and who has also worked on the US site. So I'm going to give you a quick, I'm going to share my screen and give a quick overview of what's in the new site. And so Violation Tracker UK is a wide-ranging database on corporate misconduct. We've collected data from more than 40 regulators in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. All the data comes from official government sources and links back to official government websites, or in a few cases from open records requests that we filed with the agencies. These are all resolved cases. These are not pending cases. They're not reported cases or anything of that sort. We collected a total of more than 63,000 cases. And those cases have total monetary penalties of over 12 billion pounds, but there are many cases with no monetary penalties. This is one difference between the US and the UK sites. For the UK site, we realized we needed to include cases where companies were simply cautioned about breaking the rules and not necessarily fined, because UK regulators do that a lot more frequently than their counterparts in the US. We aggregate the information for a universe of more than 670 parent companies. Here's a breakdown of the different categories, the broad categories of cases that we have in the database. We tag each entry with one of these 6 offense groups. And you can see that safety, and that includes workplace safety, accounts for the largest number of cases, followed by employment. But those are not necessarily the cases with the largest financial totals. There are several ways of researching using the site. You could just go to the homepage at violationtrackeruk.org, and you could put in all or part of a company name by itself, or combine it with one of those 6 offense groups I mentioned, or you could combine it with a regulatory agency or both, and get results that way. We also have a page of summaries where you could see an overview of the cases we have for each one of our parent companies, for each one of the industries that those parents are in, for each one of the offense groups, for the agencies, and even for the headquarters countries in which the parents are located. And finally, we have an advanced search page where you can mix and match a lot of these different variables and to do a custom search. Here's an example of an individual entry. Once you drill down in the search results, it gives you the company name. Here, there was a financial penalty of actually a large amount, 284 million pounds against Barclays. We give you a narrative description. We tell you the agencies, and below you can click through and see the source where that came from, a press release from the Financial Conduct Authority. Here's a list of the parent companies with the largest penalty totals. Airbus is at the top because of a couple of large a couple of large bribery cases, excuse me. Nortel is no longer in existence, is second because of a large pension case. And then there are some familiar UK names, Barclays, Rolls-Royce, Lloyds, et cetera, as well as parents that are based abroad, UBS from Switzerland, JP Morgan Chase from the US. And now I just want to say a few words on how the site has been used by corporate accountability groups. There have been groups such as this Western Values Project, which did a report on oil companies seeking financial bailouts, and during the pandemic, and they looked at the track record of these companies using violation tracker data. Oxfam used the violation tracker data on a poultry processor called Pilgrim's Pride as part of an effort to get the company to agree to a shareholder resolution on human rights due diligence in its operations. And they did basically a kind of dossier on the company and used our information as part of that to show the company's rather dismal track record. And finally, Public Citizen has done a series of reports using violation tracker, and I'm going to stop there because one of our speakers is from Public Citizen and is going to tell you more about the work that they've done using violation tracker. So I will stop sharing and introduce Rick Claypool from Public Citizen. He is a research director there, and his work focuses on corporate crime and money in politics.
Thanks so much, Phil, and thanks for everyone, and for joining, and thanks for having me. So yeah, I am a huge fan of the of violation tracker. I use it all the time. It's really useful for just I'll just sit back. Even just I'm going to talk a little bit about some of like the reports that we've released, sort of using violation tracker data, but it's also just very useful just if you want to. For just like testing questions, or like a quick resource to kind of look up and see, oh wait, how many violations does this company have? How, what is this, regulator doing? What kinds of violations, that kind of thing. So, while I'm going to be talking about the sort of the work that has gone, all the way from sort of, conception to publication, it is, that it's sort of a tip of the iceberg of how this is a really important tool for our work and my work in general. So I focus on corporate crime and wrongdoing, and more, and narrowly also on like money in politics and how sort of corporate influence distorts democracy, and how those intersect. So one of the biggest reports that we did using violation tracker was we had the idea to sort of not just to use it to document the sort of the rap sheets of specific companies or even categories of companies, but to look at how to monitor the activities of the regulators themselves, in particular from the frame of corporate enforcement. And so we wanted to look at how corporate enforcement changed between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. What resulted was a 2018 report called Corporate Impunity, for which we used violation tracker to look at sort of all of the corporate enforcement cases across 12 federal agencies in the United States, all of which that had been taken over by a Trump nominee, Trump appointee for that sort of first year of his time in office. So we looked at the last 2 years of the Obama administration versus the first year of the Trump administration. And what we found is that almost, entirely across the board, 11 out of 12 agencies, enforcement against corporations dropped, in many cases super dramatically. We're talking like in particular from the Environmental Protection Agency and the U.S. Department of Justice, cases against corporations dropped by 90% or more. We also saw just the number of cases dropping from agencies. And so we could sort of look at both of those questions from using violation tracker. A more recent report, I'll just shift to a sort of like a smaller quick hit report that we put out last week. Now looking at the sort of another sort of shift in enforcement policies that we're tracking. Now the U.S. Department of Justice under Biden has said that they're going to shift from just looking at the way they consider assessing penalties, not just similar kinds of violations, but they're sort of to assess whether a company should be penalized in the way that with increased penalties, like a recidivist, is to look at the entire company's case history, which makes sense. I think it's probably what the general public thinks the Justice Department is or should be doing anyway. So now that's how they're going to be doing that. So then it was very easy to sort of I basically used violation tracker to create the a cheat sheet for the government to look at companies that we know are going to be in the Justice Department's crosshairs because they're already sort of currently bound by leniency agreements, deferred and non-prosecution agreements with federal prosecutors. So that was just last week. I'll give one more quick example. We've been looking at lobbying in the States by a number of retail companies who were advocating for harsher penalties for shoplifting and theft. And some of these laws sort of go, way, above and beyond. We're talking like, for example, if there's more than one person involved in a theft and they sell whatever was stole online, suddenly that becomes a different category of felony crime that someone can go to jail for years and years for. So we noticed that some of the companies backing some of these kinds of laws or resisting the loosening of some of these kinds of laws have their own case histories. Thanks to Violation Tracker, we can see many of these companies have histories of wage theft, for which we know companies A are seldom caught, B, when they get caught, often in particular under the Trump administration, all they really had to do was sort of pay back the wrongly withheld wages. And of course, no one is going to jail for these civil cases that are, taking much more money out of, from people's pockets than what these low-level shoplifters are doing. So that's a few examples in a nutshell of what we've been up to and using it for different policy advocacy fronts. And happy to, answer questions later or, offline, feel free to ping me. I'm rclaypool@citizen.org.
Okay, thanks, Rick. So our next speaker is Richard Whittle from Corporate Watch. One of the kind of leading corporate accountability groups in the UK, does a lot of critical profiles of corporations. And our hope is that he will say something about how Violation Tracker UK will prove useful in the work of his organization and others in the UK. Richard, are you there?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Phil. You hear me okay?
You can hear you. You're not on camera.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not. I'm sorry. My camera.
All right, well, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, let me just start talking and then I'll see if I can sort the camera out for after. Yeah, thanks, Phil. Yeah, so at Corporate Watch, we do lots of company profiles, similar to some of the ones that that you guys do on the Dirt Diggers profile, and we also give training in how to research, look into, understand corporations to people challenging them in a variety of ways. And I think one of the difficult things that we found is finding details of the legal cases that they've been involved in and have gone against them. So I think Violation Tracker will be really useful for that. I think it's one of the things that, at least to my knowledge anyway, there wasn't something that, you know, a good accessible database existed on before for the UK. I think the nice thing about Violation Tracker is you've both compiled that information together, and also I think those little summaries you've done of the case, the individual cases, are really useful, because it's difficult to, like, you know, get a judgment and then summarize that, interpret that yourself in an accessible manner. So that looks great. And then the other thing that's often quite difficult to explain and also research is the web of subsidiary companies coming under a parent. So the fact that that work's done for you by the database, I think will be really useful. I mean, I guess one of the kind of underlying principles of our work is that corporations have huge power over us, and yet the basics of how to understand them, how to investigate them, aren't widely known. They're not taught as part of a normal education. So the more tools we have to help people do that, I think the better. And yeah, the Violation Tracker UK will be, I think, really useful for that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Richard. So our final speaker today is Anish Raghavan, who teaches at the London School of Economics and who is one of the most avid users of the Violation Tracker data, both the US, and he's already gotten started looking at the UK data. So Anish.
So thanks, Phil, and I'll try to keep this pretty brief because I know we have a mostly non-academic audience. I don't know if there's any academics in the room today, but if so, this is going to be kind of more high level, less rigorous, just to kind of convey some main findings and why I find Violation Tracker data to be interesting and sort of practically relevant even as an academic. And so, you know, there's also an academic event tomorrow where we'll be talking about it from a slightly different perspective as well. But anyway, so to get into this, so I am, as Phil said, probably one of the most avid users of Violation Tracker US, and I've used it a little bit in the UK, and I haven't really, and broadly speaking, what I'm interested in research-wise is trying to understand what are the sort of financial incentives that lead companies to then take things out on non-financial stakeholders, right? So, you know, if a company is facing financial pressure, how do they respond? Do they respond just by doing some accounting tricks, or do they actually make real operational changes that can harm, let's say, their employees, the environment, customers, right? So these are kinds of the big picture questions I'm interested in asking. And Violation Tracker really kind of provides the only way, at least I think, to answer these questions. And I'll give you just a couple of examples of you know, the kinds of things I've done with this. If Phil gave me an hour, I could fill the whole hour, but sadly he is not. But one example that I think would be kind of especially pertinent given the audience, and especially given, I'm glad Richard kind of alluded to some stuff on wage theft, because I was actually going to talk about exactly that. So I've got some work out there on when companies or their executives have short-term financial incentives, right? So for example, a company wants to meet an earnings target at the end of the quarter, end of the year. An executive has a bonus plan that's, you know, maybe they get a bonus if the company earns a certain amount of money. When companies have these kinds of short-term incentives and you know, the desire to make a quick buck, who pays for it? And the short answer is that at least in part, employees do. And how they pay for it is through wage theft. And so using Violation Tracker, I find that wage theft is more common, right? When companies have short-term earnings pressure, right? The idea is that I want to hit a target, so I cut some corners. The way I cut corners is by by finding ways to not pay overtime or to make people work through their breaks. Basically, by sort of loosening my employment standards, I can save a few bucks. And it turns out that companies do tend to do this. This is also true when executives have lower personal liability for wage theft, right? So there in the US at least, executives in some places can be held personally liable for wage theft, but how strongly this is enforced is varied kind of by state time. So when this liability is lower, surprise, executives are more willing to risk the financial welfare of their employees. And this, of course, is especially acute when executives are compensated in ways that encourage risky behavior. Now, one thing that I think is particularly relevant given the audience and sort of given the way the state of the corporate world today is that there's a burning desire, I feel like, to try to come up with these rankings and ratings of companies as which ones are socially responsible, which ones are the best companies as far as ESG or CSR. There's all these buzzwords you've kind of probably been hearing recently. But one thing that I thought was fascinating is that, of course, when there's a market for rankings, there are always people who will step up to provide those rankings, right? So you have all of these commercial, social responsibility, corporate social responsibility ratings. But it turns out that companies' actual compliance histories aren't picked up. There's no correlation between what companies are actually doing to their employees or the environment and these ESG ratings. And for those of you in the UK, you might remember the Boohoo scandal from last summer. This is exactly the problem. This is why Boohoo was held by so many ethical investors and lauded for so long for being a good company. None of these rankings providers bothered to actually look at what Boohoo's labor practices to take a deep look. Boohoo would just say, yeah, we're doing fine. And nobody ever bothered to check them. Violation Tracker provides a way to actually check them. And I thought, given again that we're launching the UK Violation Tracker, I would be remiss to not say something about what I've done with the UK data. And in looking at, so as Phil has mentioned, and as some of the others have alluded to, we have parent subsidiary matches for some of the UK data as well, right? So you can kind of go from the violation level and aggregate upward and figure out who actually is the ultimate owner of a given company that commits a violation. And we see that in looking at FTSE 350 members in our data, right? So this is kind of the backbone of the UK's public economy. Violating firms tend to do worse financially. And this is of course maybe relevant for those who want to find a reason to push for change. But the other thing that I should point out here, and the other reason that I want to highlight why Violation Tracker is important in the UK as well, is that once again, in the UK, there's no correlation between commercial ESG or social responsibility ratings and what companies are actually up to, right? So if you want to try to figure out, who to hold accountable, right? Which companies have labor practices that are worth, putting pressure on to change, your best bet is going to be to check what they're actually doing to their employees. And that's something that I can't think of a resource other than Violation Tracker that provides that level of information. So I'll stop there. Hopefully I haven't gone too far over time. But again, if there's any questions about any of this or any of my other work with the data or questions about any of this other stuff, I'm happy to chat offline or in the questions as well.
Okay, thank you, Anish. So we'll now open it up for questions. But before we do, I was remiss in not acknowledging our funders. We gratefully acknowledge the financial support of the following funders: the Jaffe Charitable Trust, the Joseph Roundtree Charitable Trust, and the Reva and David Logan Foundation. Their assistance made the Violation Tracker UK site possible. So now we want to open it up to questions, comments, suggestions. We would like ideas about how we could improve the UK site, as well as the US site, but particularly now the UK site, if there are things that you think we should add. And also, we do have very preliminary plans for extending Violation Tracker beyond the US and the UK. And we could talk a little bit more about that, but feel free to address that in your questions and comments as well. So Arlene is going to moderate the Q&A.
Yeah, Phil, I
So
see
take it
Phoebe.
over.
I see Phoebe has her hand raised, but there's a question in the chat about who the Oxfam sent the shareholder resolution to. Oh, which company that was?
Pilgrim's Pride.
Pilgrim's Pride, okay. Phoebe, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much, and really, really delighted that this is off the ground. I work in an organisation called Unchecked UK. We make the case for common sense and strong public protections, and we, for the last couple of years, have been documenting what the state of play is in relation to enforcement agencies as they apply to everything from the labour market to environmental protections, consumer rights, and the like. And one of the things that we've documented is that there's been a sort of systemic erosion of the enforcement capacity in the UK. Enforcement agencies have on average seen cuts of about 30%, in some cases far higher, in other cases perhaps lower, but that this is really systemic. And one of the questions I have, I mean, it's really striking that sort of finance is sort of so represented in sort of some of those league tables that you presented. And I wonder, might that be a reflection of the fact that actually the institutions that are charged with regulating the financial sector are indeed quite strong? They've perhaps weathered the storm of austerity much better, whereas perhaps the enforcement agencies as they relate to, for example, the labour market are a lot weaker now, and perhaps as a consequence, we're just not seeing, the level of corporate misconduct being reported in your tracker, because basically people are not being caught because they're not being checked, and these regulations are not being enforced in the way that they should be.
Yeah, well, one thing we found is that in the UK, as in the US, certain kinds of offenses are not, kind of heavily punished. I mean, certainly workplace offenses, are not heavily punished. In the US, as in the UK, the largest number of cases are, workplace safety and health cases, but the monetary penalties for them do not add up to anything like, the amounts, as you mentioned, for the financial ones. Now, it's true that most of those cases are brought because of offenses against kind of individuals or small groups of workers, whereas a lot of the financial offenses are practices by the big banks that, that may affect, thousands or millions of customers, et cetera. But certainly I think there is a problem with the regulatory structures where, certain kinds of crimes and offenses are being underpunished. And I don't know whether, Violation Tracker UK, will help in that process. We hope that by shining a light on, kind of the relative, amount of penalties, that might have some influence over, public policy in the UK.
And Phil, I don't know if you want, Phil, I don't know if you want to mention the differences you're seeing in the UK version versus the US version in terms of the warnings and actually getting a final financial penalty at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think I did allude to this briefly before, that actually the majority of the cases that we collected for the UK did not involve a monetary penalty. And, the total amount of penalties of about 12 billion pounds is much smaller than what we have in the US. Now, of course, the UK is a smaller economy than in the US. And actually in the US, we go back 20 years in our data collection, whereas in the UK, we only go back 10 years. So there's not a direct comparison, but even if you adjust for those differences, there is quite a big discrepancy in the volume of financial penalties.
Nigel, do you want to ask a question?
Hello. Yes, I'm interested to know if it's either currently or planned to be the case that information or data from the Financial Ombudsman Service in the UK is going to be used in the UK violation tracker, bearing in mind it's quite a significant dispute resolution service.
Yeah, I was afraid someone might raise that. I mean, we did look at the financial ombudsman, and the problem with that agency, as well as with the employment tribunal, is that there's no compilation of cases. You really need to look at the documents on, each individual case and process it individually. Thanks to the work of Anish and some of his students, we had a kind of a leg up in doing that with the employment tribunal, and we decided to take that challenge on. And we do have the employment tribunal cases, although they only go back to 2017 and not back to 2010, because the earlier cases are not online. With the financial ombudsman, it just seemed overwhelming, because I think they have about 75,000 decisions that are currently posted on the website. And apparently there's an enormous backlog of cases that they're processing. And I just worried that we would be overwhelmed if we tried to take on the financial ombudsman. I mean, we could revisit it in the future.
Is it, sorry, is it going to be open to individuals to register perhaps what might be considered significant cases where larger awards are made, just to make a start in that direction?
Well, that's an idea. We should talk about that separately. If there's a way of zeroing in on, a smaller number of more significant cases, that would make our lives a lot easier, rather than wading through.
I think the FOSS do provide certain breakdowns as well of categorizing particular offences, and under the banner of particular companies, might it be useful to have a look at whether that might provide useful information for researchers as well?
Yeah, I think, let me just chime in quickly here, though. I think one thing that's kind of paramount importance is that the data gets perceived as something that is not systematically biased in some way, right? And so the potential issue with trying to identify by hand these significant cases is that somebody could argue, well, you're doing it in a way that targets a certain industry, a certain sector, certain whatever. Now, if there's a way to sort of establish that I think is sort of we cut on penalties above X amount, if there's a way to do it, but not get accused of these kinds of you're cherry picking, then I think it's something we could consider. But I guess and especially that this is possibly even more of an issue in the UK, because the US version of Violation Tracker specifically omits cases with penalties under $5,000, right? For this kind of reason, right? That there's some that just don't really matter. The UK regulatory system is very different in that it relies a lot more on just slaps on the wrist and a lot less on actually doing anything. And so we have a lot of and for a lot of the other agencies that we look at, right? So the HSE, the Environment Agency, and those are kind of the big two. We have a lot of what are called cautions or enforcement notices, things that basically are formal notice that you did something wrong, but we're not actually going to penalize you. So I think the hard thing here would be to then come to the financial ombudsman and say, actually, for this agency, we are imposing some sort of penalty threshold. I think it would just be hard to sort of, unless there's a good reason we can do that, and maybe there is, but unless there's a good reason we can do that, I think it'd be hard to sort of incorporate it partially, but not fully, and still sort of be able to, fight off any claims of not being objective. I think that's at least my worry. Phil can maybe, if Phil disagrees, Phil should tell me that.
Well, I don't think we need to resolve this now. We'll take another look at the agency. Why don't we move on?
Yeah, thanks. Before we get to Christopher, there was just a question in the chat about whether there was scope to have a category related to human rights.
Yeah, so we do want to expand the coverage of other kinds of litigation, including human rights, including what I think are called group claims, that are kind of the rough equivalent of our class action lawsuits in the US. So we do want to look into that. We basically ran out of time before our intended launch date to get into some of those other kinds of cases. But as with the US site, we're not only do we update it periodically, actually quarterly, we add new categories of information. And it's certainly our intention to do that with the UK site as well. And human rights cases are one of the key categories we want to add.
Christopher, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Eileen, and thank you to Phil and to everybody who's worked on it. Congratulations, a big congratulations on this great achievement. We've already been using it. Well, first of all, by the way, introduction, I'm here with the European Coalition for Corporate Justice. We have network membership across the EU and Europe, so the UK and Switzerland as well. And we advocate for new supply chain corporate accountability due diligence laws, human rights and environmental due diligence laws. So there is some overlap on the general agenda of corporate accountability. And it's always useful to have the data. It's what policymakers are always after. I would just second what the previous person said, or put the question forward about a category specific to human rights would, from our side, be incredibly valuable. Also, then those judicial claims. So the class actions, the group claims, which you mentioned, Phil, collective redress claims, would be really interested to see how many of those cases are coming forward. These are obviously a different type of enforcement, judicial, not administrative, not from the agencies. A problem with some of these, I can foresee as researching them, is that a lot of the time they settle before a judgment comes down, and the settlement is confidential. So you know there's a settlement, it's announced, but you don't know what the terms of it are, you don't know what the amount is. And there's no admission of guilt. So that's maybe a caveat of it being a little bit trickier to investigate, but it's still nonetheless very useful for us to know. We want to know about those judicial claims. Particularly in the UK context, you have quite a lot of judicial claims being brought through the courts against UK multinationals for human rights and environmental harms abroad in the supply chain. This is what we advocate for. This is the type of information which would be really useful to collate. We already have this information in other sources, but having it on the website would be extra useful, I think, as well. I just wanted to ask as well, on behalf of the ECCJ membership, who are largely on the continent, is there a way to search by national company to see which, so I mean, I'm not an expert in corporate groups. Is there a way to, because we've got the US violation tracker and the UK violation tracker, is there a way, say, for an Italian NGO to search for Italian subsidiaries or Italian sister companies or holding companies related to these UK and US companies, which are already covered by the database? That would be really useful if we could get some type of country fact sheet or something like that, because I know there's a lot of interlinkages. Even though it is UK and US at this stage, there are still a lot of companies that are subsidiaries and sort of relevant for other jurisdictions. And lastly, just to say, it's great to see, Anish, this type of research is really useful as well for us to work with policymakers, to give this data, to say, you know, listen, there's a business case here based on the evidence. Companies that violate laws are not the ones that are doing, you know, great. They're less economically resilient, you know, so this type of data for us is incredibly useful. And we've seen it used by the European Commission in justifying, you know, new corporate regulation. So just wanted to say that there's real value in that type of research based on these findings, based on violation tracker. We're already seeing it being used by policymakers high up. So thanks again.
Well, thank you, Christopher. So the answer to your question about the different countries is that yes, it's actually quite easy to see all the cases that we have that are linked to parent companies that are headquartered in a particular country. So you can go, for example, on the UK site, if you go to the summaries page, one of the items there on the left is there's a drop down which lists every country that is represented among the parent companies. And you could choose, and you mentioned Italy, you could choose Italy, and it would show you the an overview of all the cases that we have that are linked to companies whose parents are headquartered in Italy. In the US site, we have the same feature in our, the US site currently has an option 1, option 2 thing, but you know, at the top of the search page, one of the drop downs there allows you to do the same thing, to choose a parent headquarters country and to see an overview of what we have relating to that country. I should also mention, you know, I'm glad to hear people's interest in the private litigation. You know, we already have quite a bit of that on the US site. We have more than 2,500 examples of what we call class action or multi-district lawsuits. Most of them are in the employment area, but we also have ones involving privacy, involving discrimination, you know, racial, gender discrimination, both against involving employees and customers, and several other categories. We have environmental cases there, and in our next quarterly update, we'll be adding product liability lawsuits, particularly against the large pharmaceutical companies. So our hope is to add similar information to the UK site, although we recognize that the class action system is not as well developed in the UK as it is in the US. But we'll see what we can find and add that in the near future.
Great. Other questions? Phil, I don't know if you want to mention briefly the plans for maybe going beyond the UK, what could come next. We're also looking for, we're interested to hear what countries this would be particularly valuable for.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing we've realized after doing the UK site is that it's not feasible to kind of replicate this database country by country. It's just an enormous amount of work. And also, to be honest, it turns out that a lot of the cases that we've gathered involve some very small companies. And you know, that might be of interest to some users, but we think that the greatest amount of interest will be in cases against large, particularly publicly traded corporations. So our intention is, as we go beyond the UK, is to take a more streamlined approach in terms of the data that we collect and focus on the types of data that would be more relevant to larger companies. For example, competition cases, or you know, what we call in the US we call antitrust, but the rest of the world calls competition. And you know, that kind of those cases are inherently relevant to large corporations because they're the ones who are going to be breaking those rules. So we will definitely include that, and we'll see what other kinds of categories it makes sense to collect. You know, one of the challenges is that in areas like employment and environment, in many countries, these cases are handled not through regulatory proceedings, but through judicial proceedings, often on a case-by-case matter. And it would be, you know, it would be very time-consuming to go through and try to track down the court records of every one of these individual cases. It would be like the financial ombudsman times 100. So, but we'll do our best to figure out what is feasible. You know, the other issue is finding the countries that have well-established, regulatory systems that are in place. That's not necessarily the case everywhere. So we have a working list of about 15 countries that we think we'd want to focus on first, and these include, the larger economies in the EU, along with, Japan, Canada, Australia, probably maybe India, a few others like that. And I guess, other European countries not in the EU. So we'll kind of take that step by step. It's also a question of resources. This work is very time consuming, both the collection of the raw data, the processing, and then the parent subsidiary matching, because that process is not, none of this is fully automated. We don't use feeds for the most part. And in some cases, we actually have to look at individual documents for a number of these cases. And, my colleague, Anthony K. Bagley here, who's done a lot of the research, can, attest to how much work is involved in kind of going through, large volumes of these cases and picking out the relevant information, and then we do the parent subsidiary matching. So, that's one of the reasons why we can't update these databases more frequently, because these are not algorithms that are putting this information together. They're human beings, and there are limits to what we can accomplish. So you'll hear more from us about our plans. Feel free to contact me individually if you want to be involved in the process. We would love to have more participants in the data collection. But also, if you simply want to make recommendations on sources or, approaches, feel free to be in touch. My email is on both the US and the UK websites, so you should have no trouble finding me.
Great, thanks, Phil. Other questions?
I have one, please, Arlene, one for Phil. Phil, could you talk about the potential for the data set once it becomes big enough to start to provide, if you like, predictive analytics, the signals of the likelihood of corporates misbehaving in some way? Can you talk to that idea, please?
Well, I will. Maybe Anish should chime in on that as well. What we found, particularly in the US, is that companies do not break the rules only once. They do it once, they're likely to do it again. And what we found, the US database in particular is to some extent an index of recidivism, because we're showing, we're documenting the extent to which larger companies are breaking the rules repeatedly. And also they're breaking different kinds of rules, right? The companies that are showing up in with the financial penalties are also companies showing up with employment-related penalties. Companies with environmental penalties, may also have consumer protection penalties. So it's, companies are not kind of stuck in an individual silo of misconduct. So, it will require, greater analytical and quantitative skills than I have to do, the more sophisticated work. But I think there's a good reason to believe that the data that we're collecting can provide indicators of which companies not only, have broken the rules repeatedly in the past, but are more likely to do so in the future. So Anish, do you want to add anything to that?
I don't have, honestly, you covered it pretty well. Yeah, the one thing I'll say is that I also have a little bit of work showing that companies do tend to switch types of violations when and you can sort of even see this in the data, right? You don't need any sort of fancy econometric modeling to tell you this, but it's almost like, maybe this is too American of a reference, difference, but it's like whack-a-mole, right? You get caught here, one regulator is looking at you more carefully, so you go do something else that's bad, right? You don't stop cutting corners, you just change which corners you cut. And that again is something that you don't need fancy statistical modeling in many cases to look at. You can just see what companies are doing and when, right? Look at the timing of violations, look at the underlying activities. And this is all enabled by Violation Tracker, because in general, there are companies that break the law a lot, and there are companies that and don't, that tend to be one-off, something bad happened, right? And what Violation Tracker does and what it kind of lays out is it makes clear kind of who's who, right? Just to kind of add on to what Phil's already said about recidivism and repeat offenders, right? Like there are a lot of repeat offenders, not everyone's a repeat offender, but it's much easier to figure out who is, who isn't, based on just looking at the data.
Yeah. I mean, I agree that not every company is a repeat offender, but a lot of them are. I mean, particularly in the US. I mean, we have examples of companies with hundreds, in a few cases, thousands of individual penalties that they have paid. Now, a lot of these are in areas like the employment area, where the workplace safety, where there are lots of what you might call little cases that might not be so little to the individual workers involved, but there are companies that do this repeatedly. But even in the financial area, where the individual fines tend to be much higher, there are a lot of the big banks show up repeatedly. I mean, that's why at the top of our US list is the Bank of America, with $82 billion in aggregate penalties. And all of the big banks are kind of clustered at the top of that list, and many of the US banks also show up near the top of the UK list, and vice versa. There are UK banks on the US list as well. And by the way, we do have kind of a ready-made list on both the US and the UK site showing which parent companies have the largest aggregate penalty amounts. So for your handy reference.
Thanks, Phil. Time for another quick question.
All right, well, I guess if we've exhausted everybody, maybe we should wrap things up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Andy was, if you want to take a minute, Andy was very instrumental in getting Violation Tracker UK. He had seen the US version and loved it, as we're so happy to hear when people do, and really helped get Violation Tracker UK. Andy, do you want to talk a little bit about how it helps the Transparency Task Force and how you hope might help other organizations in this space?
I'd be delighted to. Try stopping me. So I really like Violation Tracker USA. I fell in love with it as soon as I saw it, and really wanted to encourage the idea of it coming over here to the UK. What I find so powerful about it is it really gives us leverage on two fronts. First of all, it helps us to identify bad actors. And we need to do that. Companies spend a fortune on press and PR and messaging to try to pretend they're much better than they really are. So having something that cuts through all the noise and frankly, all the BS is really, really valuable, especially when the data is absolutely verified, when it's not about opinion, it's about hard facts. So that's really valuable, having something you can absolutely rely on to kind of compare and contrast between different organizations and different sectors. So that's great. That's absolutely fantastic. What I personally find even more beneficial is the recidivism data. The data that shows, as Phil and Anish and others have been talking about, is where the data shows that we have organizations who are failing to take the medicine. In other words, they do something wrong, they get caught, they get fined, they get a slap on the wrist by the regulator, and guess what they then do? They carry on doing it. And that comes up time and time and time again. We see that pattern all over the place, particularly in financial services. And why is that so important? That is so important because it points to the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is that the governance and regulatory frameworks around many of the industries is failing to deliver. And I make that bold statement on the basis that if a primary purpose of a regulator is to change, fix, and improve market conduct, then if we have time after time recidivism, then it's showing there is something wrong in the regulatory framework. Now, depending on how skeptical you might be, that could be anything from regulatory capture at one extreme to just under-resourcing at another. But frankly, what it means, ladies and gentlemen, from my point of view, is that if we want the world of commerce and the world of business to behave as society needs it to, we absolutely must have effective regulatory and governance frameworks. And I think Violation Tracker is an unparalleled resource in making that case. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Andy. We're at the hour. So thank you everyone for coming. We really appreciate it. I know everyone who works in this space is hoping for a more just, equitable world where workers are treated fairly and they're not cheated, and their families, they get to provide for their families, and the air that we breathe is clean. And so we're all holding these corporations accountable is how we get there. So reach out anytime. We're all very accessible. Our emails are all on our website. We're always happy to help and break down information if you run into any kind of hurdles, and we're here to all help. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, guys. Take care.